Some of the most memorable moments in the Persona series come from the romantic relationships, which are ironically just a very small part of the game. It's strange though that despite being so small, they become our main focus whenever we're given the chance to grow closer to them. So much in fact that once we eventually reach the end of their story, the main plot of the game feels noticeably dull and empty. All of a sudden, we find ourselves in a situation where we're desperately seeking out something we know doesn't exist. We try to talk to them outside of the events, and all we hear are the same repeated lines of dialogue over and over again. This is a feeling many of us have experienced before. But did you know that it actually goes back to a long time ago? All the way to the story of Sisyphus from ancient Greek mythology. Until the end of time, Sisyphus was punished with pushing a massive boulder up a mountain. And though he gave it his best, each time he got close to the top, the boulder would roll all the way back down to the bottom. This is a story you've most likely already heard of before, though I want us to consider a different approach. What if the boulder actually stayed at the top? What would happen then? Well, logically, that should be a rewarding outcome, because then the punishment would be finally over. Yet, in 1942, the French philosopher Albert Camus argued that it leads to a much worse fate. His thought was that if Sisyphus were to have finally completed the task, he would immediately lose the one thing that still gave his existence direction, the climb itself. And thus, he concluded the following: "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." But how can that be true? How can a punishment be more enjoyable? Well, to find the answer, I'd like us to compare this to Persona's romantic relationships. Because in reality, the empty feeling we get after finishing one of Persona's romantic questlines is the exact same thing Sisyphus would have had to endure if he suddenly reached the top of the mountain. Which is also exactly what Camus was referring to when saying Sisyphus is actually happy. He believed that the empty feeling comes from not having a clear purpose. But as much as I'd like to say this same phenomenon is responsible for making us feel empty after a video game romance, that wouldn't be entirely accurate. Because finishing a romantic relationship doesn't mean that the rest of the game is also suddenly over. It's only that for some reason we believe that it is. So what's actually going on here? Well, to find the answer, we need to go up. And by up, I mean all the way into space. In July 1969, astronaut Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. Aldrin had spent much of his adult life pursuing this singular, seemingly impossible goal. And with millions of people watching, returning home should have marked the beginning of a joyous, triumphant new chapter in his life. But instead, Aldrin fell into a profound, crushing depression. He summarized the terrifying reality of this situation with one simple question: what does a man do for an encore? He had reached what many would consider the ultimate peak of human achievement at just 39 years old. And because of that, ordinary life on Earth suddenly felt unbearably mundane. What Aldrin had experienced was what the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche described as the melancholy of everything completed, which basically means that as long as you're working toward a goal, life has structure and meaning. But the moment a monumental task is finally completed, the thing that once gave your life structure can also seem to disappear at the same time. It's this very phenomenon that we also experience in games like Persona. Persona, as a narrative game, essentially operates on two different parallel tracks. The structural one, which is basically the checklist of objectives you tick off when completing something like a main mission, and the emotional track, which is the story we care about most. The emotional track is the one affected by our earlier phenomenon, as well as the one that tends to include romantic relationships. This explains why the beginning of a romance feels so engaging to us, and at the same time explains why towards the end of a relationship, we also approach the question of what we should do as our own encore. Yet, unlike Buzz Aldrin's situation, our romantic relationships don't really compare to an experience as large as going to the moon. Meaning we can't really conclude that reaching a massive achievement is what actually causes our apparent emptiness. However, while that may be true, I don't think this is all that far off. Because if you think about it, we, for some reason, treat romantic relationships as though they are massive achievements. The only question is, why does this happen? Well, have you ever wondered what exactly makes a fictional character feel so captivating to us in the first place? The ancient Greek philosopher Plato argued that our true passion doesn't come from a need to uncover every last detail, but rather from the mystery of the unknown. He explores this in his famous dialogue Meno. On one apparent day, a man named Meno approached Socrates, hoping to impress him with his newly discovered definition for the unknown concept of virtue. Virtue is essentially what someone would see as a good quality, meaning it's a concept that doesn't necessarily have just one definition. Yet, Socrates knew otherwise, and so completely rejected Meno's way of thinking. And one by one, he began to dismantle each one of his definitions, ensuring that, in the end, he never reached a proper conclusion at all. But why didn't he just tell Meno that this word isn't something that was meant to be defined? Well, surprisingly, it's not because Socrates wanted to prove Meno wrong, but rather his actual goal was to push Meno into a state of unresolved confusion. This is a phenomenon the ancient Greek philosophers called aporia, and it's also something that applies to our video game romances. When we first start off a romantic relationship, we still don't yet know everything there is to know about that character. But as we get closer and closer to the end, we also start possessing more and more of that character's knowledge. It's this type of finality that Plato believed is the cause of our apparent feeling of emptiness. He understood that our interest in a subject stems from the process of obtaining it, not possessing it. Which brings us back to the beginning. Think back to those empty, repeated lines of dialogue we desperately try to interact with after the romance is over. They don't change depending on whether or not you're in a relationship, for a very important reason. Not because they're a bad gameplay feature, but rather because they're a definitive sign of closure. However, since we forget to see them that way, we chase connections that, at most, only add to a relationship that has already reached its absolute limit. Because, in the end, what we wanted wasn't to finish knowing them, we were looking to forever live in the process of knowing them.